We are starting with a brief discussion of a little bit of the historical context for the conversations that we're offering this morning. And we do this because of our deep-seated belief that it is important for us as Unitarian Universalists to know where we come from as we continue our journey, to understand a little bit about those who have gone before us, those who have bravely cleared ground and made way for us to walk as we do in each successive conversation. I am going to begin with a brief quote. For the last 4.5 years, I've had the privilege of working with Leon Spencer and Chip Roush on a project to capture some of the voices in the ongoing conversation around race in our association over the last decade and a half. And the result is this: as you can tell, there were a few perspectives on this topic. Is this small publication called The Arc of the Universe. And I want to read it because it captures for me some of our feelings about why it's important to think about what has come before our conversations and to take the time to know that. As Unitarian Universalists, we have been inventors and innovators, ones to forge new paths and to look at progress. Part of this heritage means that we have also tended to be ahistorical. We often do not know or value our own history, and failures to wrestle with our history in the past have often meant that we have had to wrestle with it in the present. So in that spirit, I'll take just a few minutes to very inadequately try to frame some of the context of this conversation that we are having here this morning. Our history is, of course, full of sacred conversations about valuing difference and about, more recently, I think, about the ways in which the different oppressions that people face are linked. These conversations are important because they really are, at one level, matters of deep belief and therefore are conversations of faith between us. These conversations have often been difficult. They have been conversations about our roles as individuals, and those of you who will recall from yesterday in the afternoon, we talked about those different levels of oppression that people experience: the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the cultural. And some of our hardest conversations have been about those institutional conversations and those cultural conversations and how we relate to them as individuals. The conversations we have had have often been about language and words. From the days when, there's a wonderful story from the church in Charlottesville, which David and I served until last year, about the women in the congregation getting together after one Sunday to paste more inclusive language into each copy of Hymns of the Spirit, the previous hymnal, to address the issue of language. Every place they found a word that was offensive, they manually pasted it into the hymnals. I think it's a wonderful image. There are definitely more recent conversations as well about how we find language that respects the identities of transgender, of disabled, of youth and young adults in our movement. This is a generational conversation. It will never end. We will always be, I believe, being the people that we are, learners of new language. These conversations have also, in our history, been sometimes coded. For a number of years, really more than a decade and a half, we as an association largely stopped talking about race and instead had conversations about urban concerns. It was a coded word for that continuing conversation. Conversations about difference and race and culture, the issues that we will be talking about this morning, the ways that oppressions are linked, are often conversations that people look at as justice conversations about social justice issues, which, as we know, some people would put in a small box in the corner of our religious movement. But others of us, including our panelists here this morning, would see them as deeply religious conversations. Ginny Corder, speaking after the 2005 General Assembly, when our youth and young adults of color were involved in a number of very difficult confrontations and conversations around transracial adoption, around cultural misappropriation, around issues of who really belongs in our association and who does not, Ginny said this: If there is a community that will be a beacon on this continent and in this world about how different people can be together across ages, races, ways of being and speaking, then we are it. We are the best hope there is, none better, and it is almost a holy trust and a sacred peace given only to us. It is time, she said, for a new revolution.
We're about to hear from a group of lay leaders and ministers having a sacred conversation about linked oppressions and valuing difference. First, some thoughts on developing multicultural competence. It means you listen and behave without imposing your own values and assumptions on others. Carries an attitude of respect when approaching people of different cultures, which entails engagement in a process of self-reflection and self-critique. Has the ability to move beyond one's own biases. Can maintain a communication style that is not based on being argumentative and competitive. Can reach shared outcomes without manipulating or wearing down others with compelling evidence. Competence in multicultural communication is being curious about the other person and seeking solutions that work across shared interests. Comfort in asking questions when uncertain or unclear about the assumptions of an individual or group. Intentionally seeking to see, hear, and understand the cultural other. As you listen to the panelists' stories, one thing to listen for is examples of multicultural competence or the need for multicultural competence. What would it mean for your congregation to be multiculturally competent?
Where have you personally witnessed Unitarian Universalists engaging in sacred conversation around oppression and/or multiculturalism?
Well, every day. Every day in the congregation that I serve, every day in the groups of colleagues with which I'm privileged to converse. For me, as an out transgender minister in the parish, the conversation deepens in new and surprising sometimes ways. And I thought I would use a little bit of my time to tell you one quick story. I sometimes say that the first sort of transgender 101 in congregations is to begin to believe that my identity as a transgender man is irrelevant. In other words, that my congregation sees me first as a minister, not as a transgender activist. But that's 101. And what I want to talk about is 102. This year in my congregation, in the last year, a lesbian couple had a baby. And in our congregation, the women of the congregation decided to hold a blessing way for that baby. And they invited women who'd had children to come and participate in a ceremony and to wear little threads around their wrist so that when they got the word that the mother was in labor, they would break that thread and say a prayer. And they did this, and it was beautiful, and the story came back to the congregation, and I found myself in the position of having to gently remind them that I could have been there. I could have participated. I am a person who's had a baby and who knows that experience. And it was a complicated and difficult moment to point that out, to tell that truth, because the first response was shame. Oh, we're so sorry, we didn't think of it. Oh, we'll get you a bracelet. I was like, no, I just wanted to remind you and to remind all of us that my experience isn't irrelevant. It is deeply a part of who I am as a member of the community and as a minister. So that's the story I wanted to share with you.
The most inspiring sacred conversations I've had in Unitarian Universalist communities have been with other people of color who are Unitarian Universalists. I grew up in a church where I was one of the only youth of color, and I experienced often that when I would bring up issues of race, that gently they would be discarded or pushed off to the side. When I was 16 and I first went to a Youth of Color Leadership Development Conference, was the first time that I had my experiences validated. what has made these conversations inspiring for me has been that I've been able to relate and felt like I belong in the UU community.
I want to highlight one particular conversation which began with a great deal of hope and ended a little differently. This was a conversation, and it was very late in the evening, thank you, at the General Assembly in St. Louis, and our Latino and Latina ministers took a great deal of effort to create and edit and prepare a video of a conversation among our Latino ministers at a convocation that they held to discuss what it's like to be a Latina minister. After the third section of this video, a European man expressed his dismay that we were even discussing the Latina sense of having been silenced. And he could not imagine that a Latina could feel silenced, nor could he imagine ever silencing a group. His statement was supported by another European man, and a third European man tried to counter their arguments, so that what happened was we had three, whether you care to call them white or European men, at the front of the room fighting over the microphone to try to emphasize how it's not possible for people to feel silenced, while our Latina ministers were sitting there astonished. When a person intervened by noting that no one but those men had been speaking for some time, and that a woman had moved forward respectfully to take a turn with the microphone and had not been observed at all by these three men, and that might be a silencing behavior in itself, the person intervening was loudly attacked as not being helpful to this conversation. I do not know how it all came out, because I was so angry and frustrated by what was going on. I did not have the intestinal strength at 11:30 at night to remain in that conversation. I went back to my room feeling ashamed and sad and frustrated. I just want to hold this up, that so often we don't even begin to see our privilege, and we are sure that we know the truth of the matter when we have been part of the group that is the model, the norm for the culture in which we live. And I'd like to invite us yet again to step back from that position and remember that our values ask us to listen. Thank you.
In my experience in Unitarian Universalism, it often takes an event, a something, to break us out of business as usual, because business as usual almost always excludes people from conversations that they need to have, excludes voices that need to be present. So I'm going to tell a story which starts out more complicated and actually ended with some redemption. This goes back about 10 years ago. I was then just on the staff, not president of the association, and I was responsible for our extension work, our growth work. And at that time, we were supporting about a half a dozen congregations that were intentionally diverse. That was the language that we used then. And one of them was in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And I was out there being director of Congregational District and Extension Services, and I preached in the morning, and then in the early afternoon there was a congregational meeting, conversation with me. Tahlequah is the end point of the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee people were forcibly relocated from their homes in North Carolina. They had to walk that trail. And our congregation there at that point was about 20% Native American, mostly Cherokee, but there were other Native peoples represented there. And in the afternoon conversation, I was trying to honor the presence of those persons, and I was talking about the tribe this and the tribe that, and the tribe is engaged thusly. And finally, one very brave woman raised her hand and said, "Excuse me, Reverend Sinkford, I have to tell you that I'm not a member of a tribe. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation, and I wish that you would refer to us in that way." And my heart sank. And I'm a person of color. I'm supposed to get this stuff right if I get nothing else right in life. But I had gotten it very wrong. But I was able to not be reactive, thankfully, and acknowledge that I had made a mistake. And what happened as a result was that the conversation opened, and the congregation was able to start having a conversation that they'd never been able to have, a conversation about what it meant to them to be multicultural, to have a significant number of their members living in Native American identities, what it meant for the Native American folks, and also what it meant for the white folks. And it's a conversation which in Tahlequah is still ongoing after 10 years, but it was one of those moments where a mistake allowed a conversation which had never happened before. To actually engage in a deep way, it's very difficult to get from casual conversation to deep personal conversation in one step. That requires a level of courage that many of us can't muster, including myself. And so techniques in congregational life like small group ministry, where there's already, it may not be down at the level of complete depth, but it's not up at the level of superficial conversation either, I think can be real resources for us.
And this process of taking time to think about who we are and then begin to have conversations about who we are is holy work. Have conversations about who we are and what assumptions, question the assumptions you might be making and begin to ask questions so that we can begin these conversations.
I'd like to hold up another tool that I learned from Marjorie Bowen-Sweetley that I suppose she gets invoked in these conversations, I hope so. And that is a culture toss, where you have a sheet where you intentionally write about your own religion, language, family background, however you wish to identify that, ethnicity, what's that? Race, what's that for you? And then, after having a rich conversation about those things, you are told that you have to give up 4 of those. Which 4 can you say, well, I suppose I could give that up? Maybe it's language. I think of the Welsh, who were forced to give up their language and are now retrieving it after 1.5 to 2 generations of having lost it. I think of hair. I think of the Native American children who were taken from their homes and had their hair cut and what that meant. I think of religion. when you've had to leave one place and have your religion taken away, to be able to feel that in your very being, even for 10 seconds, is a powerful moment. And then you are told that you have to give up 4 more of these 16. And this reminds us of where we live in repressive cultures, where we're forced to give these things up.
We have actually a terrible track record of supporting long-term sustainable ministries by ministers of color. There was a time when we tried to create multicultural, really biracial, black and white congregations in the 1980s and early 1990s. And when I joined the staff in 1994, I had the responsibility of actually closing down all but one of those because they were not sustainable. It was some of the most painful work that I ever did. What we've learned a lot in the course of these last couple of decades, is that the most dangerous thing in a relationship between a minister of color and a predominantly white congregation is for the conversations about race and culture to go underground. And so as the cultural differences are experienced when a minister of color is settled, and they could be any one of a number of things, different expectations about how much time that minister spends in the office rather than out in the community, differences of culture in terms of particular language sets and styles of preaching that a minister of color may have, which are different than the style that the congregation is accustomed to. As those differences begin to be experienced, despite all of the good intentions in the world on the part of the congregation, there start to be conversations that are not in public space but in private space. You know, boy, I wanted to have an appointment with Reverend X, and you know, he was out in the community. He hasn't been in the office for 2 days. What's going on here? I could give you many, many examples. And sadly, they have resulted in tragic ends to ministries. This is not small stuff. The Diversity of Ministry Initiative tries to provide a corrective to that, so that congregations that are interested, express an interest in settling a minister of color, are in essence required to do approximately a year of preparatory work with the Just Change consultants to get the conversations up on the table, on top of the table, so that there's a minimal risk that they'll go underground. And in essence, this is about making conversation about the impact of race and culture the way we do things around here. Making it normative.
I'm transracially adopted, and that means that my parents are of a different race than I am. My mom is 63, and she grew up a Unitarian Universalist. In the 60s, she was in LRY, and also grew up in a multiracial family. I think it was after a youth council, and probably one of my first anti-racism trainings, I came back, and I don't remember specifically what the conversation was about, but I remember using the word white supremacy. And I remember my mom responding very negatively. And as the conversation furthered, we figured out that we actually agreed on the concept of cultural supremacy, but the wording had stopped my mom from being able to listen to me. So with that, I think that the willingness to listen and to not be caught up in vocabulary and engage in deep listening is the way that younger and older people need to engage in these conversations.
Yeah, one of the things that I found, it was an experience that in many ways was similar to Alice. When I moved from the Boston area to the Midwest, I found that in helping white people understand the complexity and their complicity in forms of oppression, using language of white supremacy and white privilege was not helpful. But that there was a way of helping people see those power dynamics, but began precisely in groups asking people to identify what it is about their culture and heritage that they were proud of, and grounding them and grounding each other in that sense of pride, and then looking at places where who has power in different regards in your own community, and you can look at the interlocking things. But in that sense, for those of us who are white, I found working for racial justice isn't a matter of self-sacrifice at all. It's an enlargement of the self, an enlargement of the human community, and it is a gift that we who are white allies can bring to other whites.
Who's not here? What aren't we talking about? Do we know who our neighbors are? Who are our neighbors? That's an ancient religious question that we could be asking. So we have the tools to start conversations. We need the courage.
Yeah, courage, Sean, is a good word. Another good word here is leadership. And I hope that all of you are willing to assume some leadership around these issues, if you haven't already, and I know many of you have. But this is not actually a skill that we teach in leadership school, and perhaps we should.
This is something I'm kind of afraid to say, because I'm afraid it might be misconstrued, and so this is something that I'm really struggling with, and it relates to the theme of courage and also getting at the issues of forgiveness. I remember being so profoundly empowered by hearing a white woman, Sheila Collins, who worked with the Methodist Church very actively for issues of racial justice, and the way she said that she never expects to be forgiven for racism from people of color. Now, she didn't mean by that she wasn't going to do everything in her power to work to be accountable and to be involved in reparations, but the idea of realizing that the damage is so deep and that whenever she's seen as a white person, and why would anyone expect, right, that I'm the only white person in the universe who hasn't been tainted, right, by these assumptions. And so this kind of forgiving ourselves but not expecting it from others, I think can be a very freeing step in exercising leadership against oppression.
We've heard some amazing stories and experiences from our panel, which may be no more amazing than the stories and experiences you have had in your congregation. So here's a question to consider. What habits and patterns of engagement encourage healing and reconciliation as we continue the work of building Beloved Community? We hope that your conversations have been rich and meaningful. Once you have had time to discuss the question, take a moment to offer specific appreciation for each person in the group, in the recognition that conversations about race and oppression can sometimes be risky. Have the courage to keep the conversation going. Have the courage to be what James Luther Adams called a prophetic church. Stay open to connecting, respecting, and planning for transformation. Take all that you have gathered here and use it to keep leading Unitarian Universalism into the multicultural now. What will your congregation commit to doing as your next step? The vision of Beloved Multiracial Multicultural Community is ours. Catch it. Cast it. Lead the way.